The January wind tunneled through the 59th Street Columbus Circle station, carrying the metallic scent of brake dust and stale coffee. Commuters hunched deeper into their coats, boots clacking over salt grit tiles as the evening rush poured down the stairwells in grey, hurried waves. At the base of the southbound platform, wedged between an iron column and a vending machine, an old man lifted a scuffed violin to his shoulder. His overcoat was 3 sizes too large, patched with duct tape where wool had given up. A week's grey stubble shadowed a face more hollow than sharp, and a battered knit cap sat crooked over white hair that still parted with stubborn precision. He drew the bow across the sensitive, searching hand, let a quiet G resonate beneath the fluorescent hum. Most people didn't hear it. They heard only the hiss of doors, the robotic announcement, the slither of money sliding into MetroCard machines. But 2 transit officers did. They shared a look, one bored, one irritated, then started toward him. "Sir, move it along," the taller barked, voice ricocheting off tile. "No soliciting down here." The old man lowered his bow, expression politely blank. "Just a song." "Officer, no hat out. Policy's policy." The shorter cop gestured with a gloved hand. "Take it upstairs or pack it up." The crowd washed around them, coats brushing the violin case where it lay open, not for coins, just for space. Somewhere overhead, a sax busker wailed a brassy scale, unbuttoned. The old man nodded once, as though agreeing to an unpleasant but familiar truth. He gathered the violin to its cradle, fingers trembling more from cold than fear. Then a teenager, hurrying for the downtown express, clipped the case with her backpack. It toppled. The violin slipped from his grip, hit the tile, and spun once. As it rotated, the bridge caught the bow still in his hand, and a single accidental chord burst into the air. 4 strings, struck in perfect, brutal harmony. The sound sliced through the concourse like a bell made of sunlight, bright, aching, impossibly pure. Footsteps stopped mid-stride. A cup of coffee stalled an inch from its owner's lips. Even the saxophone player upstairs faltered, leaving his phrase unresolved. Sound seemed to pool in the sudden stillness, clinging to the vaulted ceiling before vanishing. 30 feet away, a man in a tailored black coat turned sharply, eyes narrowing. He held a leather-bound score under one arm, baton case in the other. Maestro Daniel Herrera, recently returned from conducting Mahler in Vienna, had been descending toward the Atraean, mind on rehearsal tempos, until that chord detonated memory. The old man crouched, gathered the instrument with reverence, brushing away grime as though wiping sweat from a child's brow. The taller cop grumbled, impatience cracking through his earlier authority, but even he didn't reissue the command. Something in the air unspoken, Electra had frozen hierarchy. Herrera stared. That voicing, that impossible intonation in an open subway with the resonance of a hand that once commanded the first chair with effortless authority. He stepped closer, gaze locked on the frail figure now tightening pegs with surgeon care. The rush resumed a breath, then motion but slower, softened, conversations hushed to murmurs, ticket gates shuddered on half-beats. Somewhere a phone rose, capturing the scene already turning mythic. The old man straightened, violin tucked beneath his jaw, eyes fixed not on the cops, nor on the crowd, but on a point beyond the dark rails, as if searching for the platform of a life he'd missed. When he drew the bow this time, the note was a whisper, tentative as dawn, yet every nearby ear tilted toward it, compelled by the echo of that accidental perfection, an echo promising that the cold, different station might witness something extraordinary before the night collapsed back into noise. He didn't have a name anymore, not down here. To the passers-by, he was just another fixture in the underworld of the city, part of the blurred mosaic of steam vents, pigeons, and people who slept upright in corners. No one knew he had once worn tuxedos tailored in Milan, that his hands, now calloused and trembling, had once drawn thunder from catgut and horsehair beneath chandeliers. But when he played, something ancient stirred. The strings held. Somehow, despite the fall, despite the freezing air, the violin, its varnish cracked, chin rest faded to bare maple, wasn't just a tool. It was a limb, a scar, a promise he had once broken and still carried. Arthur DeLacey, first chair, New York Philharmonic, for 15 seasons, before the silence. Back then, they called him the Hands, not for arrogance but because when he played, he didn't move with drama or flair. His expression barely shifted, but the sound, it carried storms. He could make a concert hall of 2,000 forget to breathe for 7 minutes straight. He had stood at center stage in Berlin, Moscow, Sydney, had led string sections under names carved into history, and he had gone home every night to a brownstone in Hell's Kitchen, where a daughter waited to show him crayon drawings, and a wife warmed her hands with his at the radiator. That life died in fire and smoke 6 years ago. A gas leak, one missed inspection, a second-floor window that refused to open. Arthur had gotten out, but only him. The world that gave him breath went black in one night, and when they handed him the violin, case rescued from the flames, still intact, he had no more music to give. He tried, in the beginning. He showed up to rehearsals, took the solo, missed his cues, then stopped coming entirely. No farewell tour, no final bow. He just vanished. Some said he had moved abroad. Others whispered, addiction, mental breakdown, something darker. The truth was simpler. Arthur had stepped out of his life, the way a man steps out of his suit that no longer fits, and he had descended into the subway tunnels, not because he lacked a home, but because down here, no one asked him why his eyes were always red. No one asked him to speak, just as important. No one asked him to play, until tonight. The bow quivered in his grip as his fingers found the opening shape of a Bach partita. His arm ached from cold and age. The strings fought him at first metal bite, sharp resistance, but somewhere in the third measure, the violin softened. It remembered him, played just a fragment, 6 bars, maybe 7, enough for any trained ear to recognize this wasn't street corner whimsy. This was control born from decades. The taller officer shifted, uncomfortable. Sir, you can't. He stopped. The words dried, because by now, people weren't just glancing, they were stopping. A woman in scrubs stood with her bag still over one shoulder. A man in a business coat lowered his phone mid-scroll. A child with mittens leaned against her mother's leg, eyes wide. Arthur didn't notice. He was somewhere else. In some rehearsal hall where tuning forks rang. On a stage lit with gold dot above. The conductor who had paused mid-step still hadn't moved. Maestro read, a heart pounding like a timpani roll, stared at the face now half-lit by platform glow. Arthur, dear good Arthur. And as the notes faded into the tunnel's breath, he whispered aloud to no one, that's not a homeless man, that's Arthur DeLacey. But no one had heard him yet. Not until the next note. The platform was no longer rushing, it breathed instead slow, uncertain, like the space between movements, when silence carries more weight than sound. The old man, the one with the trembling fingers and the violin, older than some of the steel in the rails, stood in the center of it all, not by command, not by spotlight, but by gravity. Arthur DeLacey raised the violin again. He hadn't meant to play, not truly, not since before. Most days he carried it like a keepsake, like a wound he could never close. On nights when the city was too loud to think, he would open the case, draw a bow across the strings once or twice, not to make music, but to remind himself he still could. But something had shifted tonight. Not just the sound that escaped when the violin fell, though, that had been frightening in its clarity. It was the way people had stopped, the way no one laughed, the way the world had paused. For him, he adjusted the pegs, more out of habit than necessity. His left wrist cracked faintly as it settled into position. The bow came to rest just above the strings, not touching, just close enough to feel the static tension between stillness and sound. Then a voice cut through the moment. Sir, one of the officers said again, this time quieter, unsure. You're not allowed to perform down here without a permit. Arthur didn't look up. He pressed the bow down gently. The first note trembled out a soft E, fragile as breath. It wasn't perfect. He didn't want it to be. He just wanted it to be true. The officer took one step forward, uncertain. Look, I don't want to. Then another voice cut in, not from the cops, but from the crowd. Let him play, said someone in a business suit. Someone else hissed, eyes locked on the old man. A ripple of quiet agreement passed through the semicircle forming around him. Arthur played on. The music didn't soar, not yet. It wandered, hesitant, like a man waking up in a house he no longer recognizes. But every note carried weight, time, loss, memory. He didn't perform for applause. He didn't perform to be remembered. He played because he remembered. The station, transformed, not visually, but rhythmically. The trains no longer roared. They hummed in harmony. The boots on tile no longer clacked. They tapped in time. For the first time in years, Arthur DeLacey wasn't surviving. He was present, and someone was watching, on the far end of the crowd. Just inside the tiled arch of the mezzanine, Maestro Daniel Herrera stood still as marble. His face had lost all trace of pretense. No critic's mask, no maestro's calm, just recognition. He watched the man's left hand, the vibrato still clean, still deeply rooted in Franco-Belgian training. The bowing hand still precise, still fluid, but more than the technique was the sound, the phrasing, the small breath before the shift, the grace of the slide between D and B-flat. It was unmistakable. Herrera had built entire seasons around that phrasing. He whispered again, barely audible, "It's him." And in that moment, he knew. The man they had stepped over, dismissed, forgotten was not just a violinist. He was the violinist, and something inside him had just woken up. Arthur reached the end of the phrase, paused, then slowly, deliberately lifted the bow. Again, the platform braced itself. The second time the bow touched the strings, there was no tremble. It began as a low, mournful phrase, simple, unadorned, drawn from the belly of the violin like it had been hiding there for years, waiting for the world to grow quiet enough to hear it. It wasn't a composition anyone could name. Not Bach, not Chrysler, not anything printed on paper. It was something older, something lived, a melody stitched from half-remembered lullabies, concert hall echoes, and the sound of a fire engine that had come too late. And it filled the subway. People stopped because it didn't sound like it belonged. Not in a station that stank of brake grease and hot pretzels. Not with the flickering fluorescence or the gum-stained tiles. But the contradiction only made it more powerful. The music rose from grime, from shadow, from the very same silence that had buried him and lifted. Arthur's eyes were closed now, not for effect, but because the past moved more clearly that way. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he stood again beneath stage lights, his tuxedo pressed, his first violin tuned in fifths. He could feel the breath of the hall, the rustle of 1,000 programs settling. He could hear his daughter laughing backstage, running scales on her own three-quarter violin, her bow hand still learning to float. He played through her memory, through the sound of his wife's voice in their tiny kitchen, through every Friday evening they'd waited for him to come home after rehearsal, through the ache of walking into an empty brownstone and realizing no one would ever wait again. And the music responded. It swelled not louder, but deeper, as if the violin had stopped being wood and string and started speaking in its own voice. People who didn't know a cadenza from a crescendo felt something tighten in their chest. Children stopped fidgeting. A businessman with earbuds in removed them. A woman dropped her phone, forgotten, on the floor. Even the turnstiles, which beeped automatically with each swipe, seemed to pause between commuters. The transit officers stood back now, wordless. And still the old man played. The sound crested into a passage, so fragile it felt like glass hovering on a high harmonic that shimmered in the fluorescent cold. Somewhere in the mezzanine, a teenager who had never heard live classical music before felt tears well for no reason she could name. Arthur slid into the final section, something improvised, but unmistakably orchestral. It had the pacing of a movement meant to end in silence. Each note was a goodbye. Each rest a breath caught between regret and grace. That as the final chord rang out, delicate, decaying into stillness, he lowered the bow, and the station held its breath. No one clapped. Not yet. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was reverence, the kind of stillness that asked, did that just happen? Then, a single pair of hands, clapping, slow, crisp. It echoed under the arched ceiling like the tail of a timpani. Roll. More followed, first from the far end, then from the mezzanine, then the middle of the crowd. A wave, not thunderous, but real, not polite, earned, and then a voice, spoken with clarity, not volume, from behind the front row. From the man who had watched it all, too stunned to speak until now. Arthur DeLacey, where have you been? Arthur looked up. His fingers were still resting on the strings, his breath shallow. He knew that voice, knew the timbre, the phrasing, the reverence threaded into it. He blinked once, slowly, as the crowd parted. Their black coat, baton case, open disbelief etched across his face, stood Maestro Daniel Herrera, and Arthur smiled. Not a wide smile, not a triumphant one, just enough, as if to say, finally, someone remembered. Herrera didn't move at first. He just stood there, shoulder-length coat dusted with flakes of soot from the station's ceiling, his leather baton case forgotten in one hand, his other pressed flat against his chest as if confirming his own heart was still beating. "Arthur," he said again, louder this time. "Arthur DeLacey." The name echoed through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water, and now the others turned to look not at Arthur, but at the man who'd spoken. Some recognized Herrera instantly, others only saw a well-dressed man breaking the unspoken rule of New York commuters: never engage. But Herrera didn't care. He stepped forward slowly, as if afraid that one sudden movement might break the spell. Arthur didn't answer. He just looked at him, bow lowered, violin cradled gently in his hand, and tilted his head, like a bird remembering a forgotten song. "I thought you were dead," Herrera said. The words left him before he could temper them. Arthur blinked. Once, close enough. A tight murmur moved through the crowd, realization spreading like ink through cloth. The old man with the crumpled coat, with the patched shoes and bowed shoulders, the man who had been shooed away, almost arrested, was someone great. Daniel Herrera closed the last few steps, stopping just short of the violin's reach. He looked down at it, a battered, old German model, varnish worn, bridge slightly warped hand, then back at the man holding it. "You played Mahler's Fifth with me," he said quietly. "That adagio, you played it like you were holding time still." Arthur's voice came slow, as if unused to being heard. "I wasn't holding time, I was trying to let it go." The platform exhaled. The woman in scrubs wiped at her cheek. A man in a Yankees cap pulled out his phone, but even he didn't dare record just yet. Herrera straightened, visibly moved. "We need to get you off this platform. Come upstairs. Come with me." Just his voice cracked. "Come back." Arthur looked down at the violin in his hands. The strings were still humming faintly from the last note, not resonance, like the wood itself remembered what it once was. "I'm not who I was," Arthur said. "You are," Herrera replied, without hesitation. "You just forgot." "They forgot. But I haven't." Arthur studied his face for a long moment. Then, to everyone's astonishment, including Herrera's, he smiled again, just slightly, enough to crack through the stillness. "Then why does my name still feel like an apology?" Herrera didn't answer, because he couldn't, not yet. Instead, he turned to the officers still lingering nearby, still frozen between duty and disbelief. "Gentlemen," Herrera said with quiet command, "you will not remove this man. You will not ask him to leave. You will not touch him. Do you understand?" They exchanged a glance. One of them swallowed. The taller nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good." Herrera turned back. "Play again, Arthur." The request wasn't polite. It wasn't a plea. It was a recognition. A stage manager drawing open the curtain after intermission. Arthur hesitated, then lifted the violin, set the bow, and this time, the crowd gathered not because of pity, but because they were about to witness something holy. He lifted the violin with deliberate care. Not slow, not dramatic, just careful. Like it was the first time in years he dared to call it his again. Arthur's chin touched the rest. His left hand found the neck. The bow rose, hovered, and then he froze. Not visibly, not fully, but enough that Daniel Herrera, standing just off his shoulder, saw it in the fingers, the slight tremble in the index, the pressure not quite reaching the string, the hesitation born not from age, but from somewhere deeper. They're all watching. What if they only saw the shadow? What if this second song unmakes the first? For a moment, he heard only doubt, not the crowd, not the platform hum, not even Herrera's breath beside him, just the echo of old ghosts. "You missed the entrance. Arthur, the section was waiting for your cue. It's okay, he's just not the same anymore." He closed his eyes, the violin still poised but untouched. One heartbeat, two, 1,000 from the years he lost. From behind, Herrera leaned in, not pressing, not rushing, just near enough to speak where only Arthur could hear. "You're not performing," he said gently. "You're remembering." Arthur didn't open his eyes, but his fingers shifted slightly. The bow settled closer. "I lost the sound," he whispered. "No," Herrera said. "You buried it." Arthur's jaw clenched. "What if I can't bring it back?" A pause, then "Let it find you." Another breath passed, then two more. The platform didn't move. No one said a word. Even the tunnel wind held off, as if the whole station waited on one man's decision. And then, he played just a note at first, a low D simple, sure. Then, another. A phrase emerged, tentative, but full of weight. Not the grandeur of a concerto, not yet, but something more private, a memory unraveling note by note, and slowly, the bow grew bolder. The music carried him forward, note by note, out of the shadow, until the sound filled the platform again, not perfect, not polished, but true, and unmistakably Arthur. Herrera exhaled, a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The tension in the air loosened. One of the transit officers, without realizing, took a step back like someone in a church. Arthur opened his eyes, mid-phrase, and glanced sideways just enough to see Herrera still there, steady as a conductor's podium. He didn't nod, didn't need to. The music was nodding for him, and the doubt, it hadn't disappeared, but it was being drowned, slowly, deliberately, note by note, because even after all this time, the sound still remembered him. When the final note of that quiet, hesitant passage faded into the rust-stained tiles and cold tile air, the crowd didn't clap, they didn't move, they didn't even blink. It was as if the entire station had become an instrument, and no one wanted to break its last vibration. Arthur lowered the violin. This time, the bow didn't shake, but he did, not with fear, not with doubt, but with the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. The silence wasn't absence, it was recognition. The kind that doesn't need sound, the kind reserved for moments when everyone in the room realizes they've witnessed something they weren't meant to forget. And then, from just behind him, Herrera stepped forward, not with fanfare, not with ceremony. He didn't make a speech, he just said his name, clearly, fully, not a nickname, not a title. Arthur DeLacey. The syllables rang out, clean as a bell, and the silence changed. Now it was charged, crackling with realization. People turned, their eyes wide. Some blinked, a few mouths parted slightly. No one asked who, they didn't need to. They could feel it. The name fit the moment, like the final cadence of a symphony. A tourist near the stairwell whispered it to her partner. A teen at the edge of the crowd typed it into his phone and gasped when the results loaded. Photos appeared grainy, black-tied, triumphant. That's him, the screen seemed to say. A woman in an MTA vest slowly reached up and removed her cap, and Arthur just stood there, still as stone, still as memory, his chest rising in quiet, controlled breaths, like someone remembering how to live. It had been years since anyone said his name out loud in a way that meant him. He had been Sir, or move along, or worse, invisible. And now, suddenly, all that silence came roaring back, not as shame, but as acknowledgement. Arthur met Herrera's gaze, eyes glassed just slightly. You remembered, he said, voice low, gravelly. I never forgot. Herrera replied. A pause, then a voice from the crowd, someone unseen, brave enough to speak. Will he play again? Arthur glanced down at the violin in his hand. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. He didn't ask permission, didn't bow, didn't say a word. He lifted the violin beneath his chin, tightened the bow, and let the silence ask the question one more time. His answer came in music. The moment his bow touched the strings again, the platform transformed. This was no longer the trembling sound of a man remembering. This was something else, something earned. Arthur played a piece no one could name, not because it was unknown, but because it was new, drawn from years of silence, composed in grief, carved into muscle and scar. It had the fire of Mahler's longing, the restraint of Mozart's breath, but it was entirely Arthur's. The crowd shifted, now not merely curious, but transfixed. Even the transit announcements seemed to lower themselves, respectfully muted behind glass, as the maestro in rags pulled the past out of wood and air. People moved closer, unconsciously, like moths to warmth. A man in a delivery uniform leaned his bicycle gently against a pillar and took off his cap. Two tourists sat down on their luggage. A little girl with wide eyes and pink earmuffs reached out to her mother and whispered, "Is that magic?" And her conductor of every major hall from Vienna to Boston stood, with his arms folded, silent, watching. He didn't conduct, didn't interrupt. He knew better than to touch this moment. Then, halfway through the piece, Arthur's right foot stepped slightly forward, a shift in posture. He lifted the tempo, changed the key, built the sound into something bolder, riskier, not defiant, joyful. It was a moment only someone who had once lost everything could summon. Reclamation of space, of breath, of voice. The last time he played with such freedom, his daughter had been alive. The final passage climbed upward, note by note, as if reaching toward something unseen. Not perfection, not redemption, just peace. And when the final note came, held for just a breath longer than expected, and fell into silence, the entire platform erupted, not like a concert hall applause, polite and measured. This was raw. Hands clapped overhead, cheering filled the vaulted ceilings. Someone whistled. A woman cried and didn't care who saw. Even the transit officers clapped, awkward and red-faced, unsure what else to do. Arthur didn't bow. He simply stood, violin still in hand, as the sound washed over him, and somewhere behind him on the steps leading up to the turns, MTA supervisor had arrived, furious, demanding to know who authorized this disruption. Herrera stepped forward, calm, composed. He held up one finger, pointed to Arthur, and said, "That man just turned a subway platform into Carnegie Hall." The supervisor froze. Herrera continued, louder now. "His name is Arthur DeLacey, concertmaster, father, artist, survivor. This city let him disappear once. We won't do it again." And just like that, the cheer returned, louder, wider, longer. A man who had been forgotten for a decade now stood in the center of a public ovation, not because he demanded it, not because he asked for it, but because his truth finally was undeniable. The applause eventually faded, not all at once, but in slow waves like the tide pulling back from a shoreline it wasn't ready to leave. Arthur stood in the middle of it all, quiet now, the violin still balanced lightly in his hand. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes had changed, softened, clearer, like fog lifting after a bitter winter. He didn't speak at first, didn't rush. He looked around at the crowd, at the girl in pink earmuffs, the tourist holding her chest with both hands, the conductor watching him like a father might watch a son return home after too many years. Then, slowly, Arthur raised the violin again, but not to play, to offer. He held it out in front of him, like an artifact, or a gift. "This," he said softly, his voice carrying in the stillness like a solo flute, "is the only thing that survived the fire." There were no microphones, no stage lighting, just the gritty light of a subway ceiling, and one man standing like he belonged. "I lost everything else," he said. "My wife, my daughter, my house, my reason." He looked down at the violin, but not this. The crowd said nothing. They didn't need to. "I used to think it cursed me," Arthur continued, "that every time I opened this case, it was asking me to remember what I'd buried, but it wasn't." He looked up now, directly into the crowd. "He was asking me to come back." He paused, and the bow rose one last time. "This isn't a performance," he said. "This is a prayer." And then, he played. No introduction, no warm-up, just a long, winding melody, part classical, part lullaby, part unspeakable ache. He played the birth of his daughter, the night he met his wife in the rain outside Juilliard, the weight of silence after the funeral, the years spent underground, and the note, just one, that had brought him back. It was not flawless. His hands shook once, his pinky slipped slightly on a high trill, but no one noticed, because every person watching knew they were hearing something that had nothing to do with sound. Arthur had found his voice again, not the one in programs or recordings, but the voice that lived in wood and string and breath, the voice that doesn't beg to be heard, only to be true. And when the last note fell gently, like snow melting on stone, he let the silence ring, then bowed his head and tucked the violin back into its case, as though it had done what it came to do. The crowd didn't cheer this time, not loudly. They just stood in stillness, some crying, some smiling, all changed. Herrera stepped forward again, blinking back something in his own eyes. "Come with me," he said. Arthur shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he said, "but soon." Then he knelt, zipped the case closed, picked it up, and for the first time in years, he walked upright. By the time dawn stretched its pale fingers across the city's skyline, most of the world had already moved on. The trains rumbled through their morning routes. Newspapers spilled headlines about politicians and power outages. The station had been swept, the vending machine restocked. The sound of Arthur's violin had vanished into the tunnels like a ghost, but in a rehearsal room 4 floors above Lincoln Center he returned. He stood just inside the doorway, same threadbare coat, same old violin case in hand, looking at the room where he'd once led the orchestra with a glance. No one saw him enter at first. The musicians were already warming up, tuning strings, rustling sheet music. The assistant conductor glanced toward the door, blinked, then froze. Conversation stalled. Bows paused mid-air. A second later, Herrera stepped out of his office at the back of the hall. His tie was crooked, his coffee untouched, but his eyes lit with something between joy and disbelief. "You came," he said, not as a statement, but as something halfway between gratitude and relief. Arthur nodded, quietly. No fanfare, no press, no flashbulbs, just the man and his violin. Herrera motioned to the stand beside the concertmaster's chair. "Your place is there." Arthur walked slowly across the carpeted floor. The others parted to let him through, watching with something deeper than curiosity, respect, or maybe even reverence. He didn't sit in the chair, not yet. Instead, he opened the case, removed the violin, tuned each string G, D, A, E just like he had done every day for 20 years. Then, before he raised the instrument, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a faded scarf, deep red, worn, gentle dot. He draped it softly over the music stand. His daughter's scarf. She used to wear it when she came to watch him rehearse, swinging her legs in the front row, drawing pictures of violins with crayon and whispering, "That one's you, Daddy." Arthur took one long breath, then nodded. Herrera lifted his baton, and the first note of rehearsal rang out not with polish, but with presence. They played slowly that morning, tenderly, no racing, no perfection, because something far more powerful had returned to the room. Truth. Outside, the city roared to life. Horns blew, tires screeched, phones buzzed, but inside, a man who had once fallen through grief and silence, now stood surrounded by music again. No announcements, no crowds, no ovation. Just a quiet encore at sunrise, a prayer whispered in harmony, and the sound of a violin that would never be silenced again. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the quiet strength we often overlook. Sometimes, the people we pass by carry entire symphonies within them, waiting only for someone to listen. Subscribe if you believe in second chances, silent heroes, and the music that lives in all of us.